Greek bishop exposes Neo-Modernist Synodality. True and false ressourcement. In 1575, the Lutheran heretics sent a letter to the Greek Patriarch of Constantinople, Jeremias II. In their hubris, they assumed that the Greeks would confirm their false doctrines of the so-called five solas. They had claimed these solas had restored the faith of the early church. They were surprised to learn that the Greeks condemned their doctrines just like Tren. But it's more complicated than that. Rome and the West have always been in a position of resourcing the Greek and other Eastern traditions. 1575 was merely the high watermark for one of the most significant movements of this kind, known to history as the Renaissance. The so-called Byzantine papacy, 537 to 752, is another movement like it, and so is the so-called High Middle Ages. The complicated reality is that the heretics and the Catholics from the West both want to mine the treasures of Greek wisdom, but for entirely different ends. The heretics have always wanted to find justification for their heresies in the East, whereas the Orthodox have striven to bring about a higher Catholic synthesis of East and West. The heretics seek to use the Greeks to destroy the Latin tradition, but the Orthodox restore Greek in order to exalt the veritatis splendor of Greco-Roman Christendom. The trad weakness about Vatican II. This is most acute when we evaluate one of the weakest points in our trad movement, our critique of Vatican II. This weakness results in part from an error which Kennedy Hall calls no salvation outside Thomism. There's a certain post-Tridentine excess that overreacted to the heretical resourcing of the Greeks and became hyper-Latinizing hyper-Thomism, especially after 1870, which helped create hyper-uber-ultramontanism, which is the false spirit of Vatican I. If this obtains in our movement, we fail in our critique of Vatican II to distinguish between the Orthodox ressourcement of the East and the Neo-Modernist version. As I discuss in my book, City of God versus City of Man, it was for this reason that the Eastern Catholic bishops sided not with the Cetus, the Curia, but with the European alliance. The Cetus are our trad godfathers, Archbishop Lefebvre and the Cetus Internationalis Patra. Side note, this is why at OnePeterFive we are trying to reverse this false alliance with a more sound trad attitude of the East, but that's beyond the scope of this essay. Now, unfortunately, I have seen this equivocal critique from Archbishop Lefebvre in his book, Letter to Confused Catholics. Obviously, the main point of the Archbishop is absolutely correct and prophetic. Namely, the Council, Vatican II, was an occasion for the Neo-Modernist conspiracy to impose their ugly neo-iconoclasm on the faithful, leading to the loss of souls from the Ark of Salvation. However, the Archbishop fails to make the distinction necessary to gain an ally in the Eastern bishops, who also oppose neo-iconoclasm and have their martyrs and the Sunday of Orthodoxy to prove it. Orthodox collegiality versus the neo-modernist schismatic way. Now, this is evident in the SSPX critique of collegiality. If we understand collegiality in the terms of the schismatic way, collegiality is an obvious error that Lefebvre also suffered from, as the French episcopate attempted to destroy him with calumny and a conspiracy of lies. However, in order for this critique to hold water against the faithful Catholics in the communio crowd, we must distinguish between the truly orthodox tradition of collegiality and the obvious insanity of the neo-modernist schismatic way. Thankfully, the schismatic way is uniting Catholics from all stripes to oppose the regime of iconoclasm which is in power in the Vatican. A Greek bishop throws down the gauntlet. Recently, Greek Catholic Bishop Manuel Nin, the apostolic exarch to Greece, has emerged to take a stand. He makes the proper distinction about ecclesiality and voices his concern about the schismatic way. The first distinction he makes is that true Orthodox collegiality is episcopal. Quote, when it is stated that you in the East have always had a synodality, is there not a danger of misunderstanding when, looking at the Eastern churches, one confuses synodality with episcopal collegiality? The latter, in the East, is associated with the exercise of authority, the pastoral ministry, the service within the Christian churches that takes place in the assembly of bishops, belonging to a particular church and is headed by a patriarch, an archbishop, or a metropolitan. End quote. So the first aspect of a traditional and orthodox collegiality, according to Bishop Nin, is that it concerns the bishops alone to be in power. He further adds the following, quote, "If the West understands synodality as a place or as a movement where everyone, laity and clergy, act together in order to arrive at some ecclesiastical, doctrinal, canonical, disciplinary decision, whatever it may be, it becomes clear that such synodality does not exist in the East." End quote. What the schismatic way presents is another rehash of Vatican I and Vatican II, a mob mentality which utilizes the press to put pressure on the bishops to react to a certain conclusion. Side note, Lord Acton and von Dullinger, together with Georg Ratzinger, the great uncle of Joseph Ratzinger, all put pressure on Vatican I by manipulating the press. This is not a traditional lay involvement in ecumenical councils, which traditionally for the lay nobility is to 1, protect the bishops with their armies, and 2, input their own wisdom in a limited way, but only for the sake of the depositum fidei. Side note, here we make mention of the highly cultured layman, Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola, at the Ecumenical Council Lateran V, in which he rebuked Leo X and called on him to reform the church, otherwise the wrath of God would fall upon them. And the Catholic Encyclopedia article under Leo X makes mention of the fact that this prophecy of a layman at an ecumenical council was later fulfilled that very year when Luther revolted against the church. The subject of the synod is Christ and his doctrine. The second distinction Bishop Nin makes is that the term synhodos, synod, means to walk with Christ. It is not merely a mob rushing off the cliff of heresy. Quote, "It is not a march of all together, but rather a march of all together with Christ." End quote. We've already seen that the Instrumentum Laboris does not distinguish between the Spirit of the world and the Holy Spirit when it claims that the schismatic way is guided by the Holy Spirit, since it is literally polling the world, including non-Catholics, about what they want the church to do and say. The process of the schismatic way is all set up to impose the spirit of the fallen angels on the faithful and claim that it is the work of the Holy Spirit. Only if Christ's own doctrine is the subject to be defended and explicated against the spirit of the world can the Holy Spirit be said to be present. Quoting again from Bishop Nin, "It should be clearly emphasized that synodality in all Christian churches, be they Eastern or Western, cannot be a cover that shows us to the modern world and also to each other as if we are a modern Western republic, parliamentary possibly, where everyone can say anything and talk about everything." End quote. The modern democracies are built on the lie of liberalism that majority rule is infallible. This lie allows the fallen angels to whip up the mob for whatever the mob is bloodthirsty for. We saw this at Vatican I and Vatican II. And Cardinal Nortini's dream of synods on synodality is imposing a perpetual revolution in the church, world without end. Catechism and mystagogy. Bishop Nin describes traditional collegiality as traditionally used by the fathers as, quote, "an instrument for catechism and mystagogy," end quote. Because of the dominance of hyper-uber-ultramontanism, Vatican II, under the strong influence from the Eastern Catholic bishops, attempted to restore something of episcopal integrity with such gems as Lumen Gentium 27, which implicitly condemns hyper-uber-ultramontanism. But the Neo-Modernists used this for their version of synodality, seen in the aforementioned efforts of the French hierarchy to destroy Lefebvre. Now we have single Orthodox bishops who are slowly raising their heads against the heretics. Strickland, Burke, Schneider, Nin, Paprocki. But they are isolated against a sea of modernists. What they need, and what we need, is a true collegiality between these Orthodox bishops. Let them assemble a synod of their own, together, and bring about their own catechism and mystagogy, and give the faithful the spiritual mercy of the charitable anathema. Their Orthodox Synod could start with this gem from Vatican I. Quote, "If anyone shall assert it to be possible that sometimes, according to the progress of knowledge, a sense is to be given to the doctrines propounded by the Church different from that which the Church has understood and understands, let him be anathema." Postscript. Reminder of the proven trad solution to our crisis, the charitable anathema. Practical steps for resolving this crisis. 1. Every bishop has jurisdiction over the communion of his diocese. 2. Every bishop has the power and authority to anathematize heresy. If he judges it necessary, he can also do this from a diocesan synod, Synodality. 3. Every bishop has the ability to identify and name the chief errors of our time. The Declaration of Truth, signed in 2019 by prominent bishops like Cardinal Burke and Bishop Schneider, has already laid out the most common errors posed them. 4. Every bishop should issue the charitable anathema for all Catholics in his diocese. Taking the aforementioned Declaration of Truths, a bishop can simply issue a decree such as this, quote, "If anyone does not confess the truths contained in this declaration, according to the sense and understanding that the Church has always taught and teaches, let him be anathema." End quote. If this seems extreme, why not simply do the same with the Professio Fidei that is already on the books, or the Oath Against Modernism that, according to theologian John Joy, is an infallible oath promulgated for decades since St. Pius X. 6. Every case of heresy must be judged properly with truth and charity. This can and should be done locally, not only by the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith.